What if I told you two men, same age, same job, same salary, same $80,000 in the bank, end up worth completely different amounts 20 years later, purely because of one decision they made in their early 30s? Stick around, because the answer isn't what most people on YouTube will tell you. Say hello to Mark and Dan. Both are 32, both live in the same city, both bring home $80,000 a year, and after years of skipping vacations, packing lunch instead of buying it, and telling themselves that the store brand coffee tastes just as good, both have managed to stack up exactly $80,000 in savings. On paper, financially, these two guys are twins. Personality-wise, not even a little. Mark craves stability. He wants to know what tomorrow looks like. He dreams of a place that's truly his, a garage to fill with tools he'll probably never learn to use properly, a yard he'll obsess over like it's a small kingdom, and total freedom to knock down a wall if he feels like it. Dan is wired differently. He wants options open. He has no clue where he'll be living in 5 years, and that uncertainty doesn't scare him, it excites him. The thought of being tied to one address for 3 decades makes him a little uneasy. Those two mindsets eventually push them toward two very different money moves. Mark buys a house, Dan keeps renting. And over the next 20 years, we're going to track both paths side by side. Every mortgage bill, every rent hike, every surprise repair, and every dollar Dan pockets by not owning and actually puts to work in the market. By the end, we'll find out where two guys, who started with identical paychecks and identical savings, actually land. Let's dig in. Mark and Dan start out renting in the same mid-sized American city. After weeks of scrolling listings and touring more houses than he'd like to admit, Mark finally lands on the one. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a modest backyard, and a garage roomy enough for gym equipment that'll gather dust. He pulls the trigger. Price tag, $350, zero. Mark puts down $70,000, a full 20%, leaving him with a $280,000 loan. But the down payment isn't the whole story. There's closing costs, lender fees, title work, inspections, prepaid taxes, and roughly 4 dozen papers he signs without fully understanding. Closing costs typically land between 2 and 5% of the purchase price, so on a $350,000 home, that's anywhere from $7,000 to $17,500 just to get the keys. Let's say Mark's comes out to $10,000. That means, before he's even unpacked a single box, his entire $80,000 is gone. $70,000 into the down payment, $10,000 into fees. He locks in a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. Principal and interest alone run him about $1,863 a month. Then add roughly $350 in property taxes, $150 in insurance, and another $290 he sets aside monthly for upkeep, about 1% of the home's value per year. All in, Mark's starting monthly housing bill sits around $12, $653. Dan's math looks nothing like that. He rents a similar 3-bedroom nearby for $2,000 a month. No taxes, no insurance, and if the water heater dies tomorrow, that's the landlord's head ash, not his. That leaves Dan with $653 extra every single month. For a second, that spare cash starts whispering beach vacation. But Dan holds the line. Instead, he funnels every bit of it, along with the $80,000 he never spent on a house, straight into a broad stock market index fund. Right out of the gate, Dan's approach looks solid. Similar house, lower monthly cost, and his money is already working for him. Now, someone will inevitably say, sure, but Dan's rent money just vanishes, while Mark's mortgage builds equity. Technically true, but here's the catch. In the early years, that equity crawls forward at a snail's pace. In month 1 alone, Mark pays $1,633 in interest, on top of $350 in taxes, $150 in insurance, and $290 for maintenance. Out of his $2,653 monthly payment, only about $230 actually chips away at what he owes. The remaining $2,423 is simply the cost of keeping a roof over his head. Dan, meanwhile, hands over $2,000 in rent that builds nothing, but calling that wasted while treating mortgage interest, taxes, insurance, and repair bills as some kind of investment is a bit of a stretch. Fast forward 3 years. Mark has made 36 payments, built a little equity, and learned the golden rule of home ownership. Every weird noise in the house now comes with a price tag. One weekend, his water heater quits. He watches a video titled "Fix It Yourself in 10 Minutes," spends 4 frustrating hours on it, then finally calls a professional. A few $100s later, it's sorted, thankfully. That's exactly what his maintenance fund was for. After 3 years, Mark's loan balance has dropped from $280,000 to about $270,835, just over $9,000 in principal paid down. Assuming the home appreciates 3 to 4% annually, it's now worth somewhere between $382,000 and $394,000, giving him roughly $112,000 to $123,000 in equity. That's real, tangible wealth. Dan, on the other hand, has paid $72,000 in rent over those same 3 years, but his original $80,000 stayed invested the whole time. At a 10% average return, that alone has grown to around $16,000 in gains. Add his ongoing monthly contributions and their growth, and his portfolio now sits around $130 zero. So after 3 years, it's basically a dead heat. Mark has equity locked in his walls. Dan has a portfolio he can access any time. Mark can paint his living room neon green if he wants. Dan can pack up and relocate next month without a second thought. But as the years roll on, the numbers on both sides start to shift. Mark's principal and interest payment is frozen in place, but that doesn't mean his total cost of owning stays flat. As his property's value climbs, so do his taxes. Insurance creeps up too, and as the house ages, repair bills start getting more creative. Dan, meanwhile, is watching his own expense grow: rent. He started at $2,000, but each year it inches higher. $2,060, then around $2,122, then a bit more the year after. Nothing about his apartment has changed except how much leaves his account every month. His landlord, apparently, is also a fan of compounding. With rent climbing roughly 3% yearly, that $653 head start Dan enjoyed at the beginning slowly erodes. This is where time quietly starts favoring Mark. His mortgage payment doesn't budge while Dan's rent keeps creeping upward. Still, Dan holds one enormous advantage we haven't fully weighed yet: that original $80,000, sitting in the market this entire time, compounding away. At a 10% yearly return, that sum alone has serious potential to balloon over 2 decades, even before counting his additional monthly deposits. This doesn't mean Mark made the wrong call. His money went into a house that was also gaining value and building equity. But that $80,000 had another possible destiny, and a fair comparison has to account for it. Jump ahead to year 10. Mark is 42. His home, appreciating between 3 and 4% a year, is now worth somewhere between $470,000 and $518 zero. His remaining mortgage balance sits around $240,000, which puts his equity between roughly $230,000 and $278 zero. He strolls through his property these days, feeling like he practically owns half of every brick in it. Along the way, he's also spent money on repairs and upkeep. Some of it added real value, some of it simply kept the house from slowly falling apart. Dan, meanwhile, has stayed the course. His original $80,000, growing at 10% annually, is now worth roughly $207,000 on its own. Factor in the monthly investments he's kept making, smaller now that his rent has crept upward, and Dan's total portfolio lands around $290,000. So a decade in, Dan is still ahead on paper in liquid wealth. But something's shifted. His rent is no longer $2 zero. After 10 years of 3% annual bumps, it's crept up toward $2,700 a month, while Mark's mortgage payment is still sitting right at $1,863. Now let's leap to year 20. Both men are 52. Mark's house, still climbing 3 to 4% a year, is worth somewhere between $632,000 and $767. Zero, his loan balance has shrunk to about $160,000, leaving him with equity somewhere in the range of $472,000 to $607. Zero, Dan's portfolio has also been compounding for 2 full decades. His original $80,000 alone has swelled to roughly $538,000 at a 10% return, not even counting the extra monthly contributions from the years when renting was still cheap. Add all of that together and Dan's total portfolio lands around $750. Zero, so purely on net worth, after 20 years Dan edges out ahead. But their wealth looks completely different in practice. Dan's money is liquid. He can move it, spend it, rebalance it whenever he wants. Mark can't exactly sell off 8% of his kitchen when he needs cash. Still, Dan carries one expense that never disappears: rent. After 2 decades of 3% yearly hikes, his original $2,000 rent has climbed to around $3,600 a month. Mark, by contrast, has just 10 years left before his mortgage is paid off completely. Dan's rent has no finish line in sight. But Dan's outcome hinges on one critical condition. He actually had to keep investing every single month, without fail. When the market's soaring, you invest. When it drops 30% overnight, you still invest. When the news declares capitalism dead for the 4th time that decade, you keep investing anyway. The spreadsheet assumes iron discipline. Real people, unfortunately, often have other plans. That money meant for the market quietly turns into a nicer car, a couple of extra trips, a slightly upgraded lifestyle, and years later, the portfolio that looked incredibly on paper somehow never actually materialized. A mortgage, by contrast, forces the saving to happen automatically. Mark never has to decide each month whether he feels like building equity. The bank has already made that call for him, and behaviorally, that discipline matters a lot. Still, buying isn't without its own weak spots. First is timing. Had Mark sold after just 3 years, closing costs going in, selling fees going out, and those early interest-heavy payments could have completely erased his advantage. Buying generally needs years to let the math work in your favor. Second is flexibility. Imagine both men get amazing job offers in another state a few years into this journey. For Dan, the move is simple: hand in notice, pack, or go. Mark has a toga call. He can sell, dealing with agent fees and finding a buyer, or rent the place out and move away, now juggling a mortgage in one city and rent in another, hoping his tenant covers the bills. Any gap comes straight out of his own pocket, cutting into what he can save elsewhere. Then there's concentration risk. Dan's portfolio spans thousands of companies across the market. Mark owns exactly one house, on one street, in one neighborhood, in one city. If that area booms, great for him. If the local economy tanks, he can't just rebalance by selling off the upstairs bathroom. And finally, liquidity. If Dan suddenly needs $20,000, he sells a slice of his portfolio and moves on. If Mark needs the same amount, he's looking at refinancing, borrowing against his equity, or selling the entire house. Home equity is real wealth. It's just not easy to spend in pieces. So which wins, buying or renting? Honestly, it depends. Buying makes more sense when you plan to stay put for a long stretch. 7-10 years or more gives those upfront costs time to fade into the background, lets principal pile up, and lets a locked-in payment become more valuable as rents keep rising. It also helps when home prices are reasonable compared to rent. One quick gut check is the price-to-rent ratio. Divide the home's price by a year's worth of comparable rent. Here, $350,000 divided by $24,000 in annual rent gives us roughly 14.6. Once that number climbs well above 20, renting typically becomes the smarter bet. Though it's just a rough guide, since mortgage rates, taxes, insurance, and expected returns all still matter. Renting shines when home prices run high relative to rent, when flexibility genuinely matters to you, and when the renter actually follows through and invests what they save. And really, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Buying a house doesn't mean investing has to stop, because personal finance was never about finding one flawless formula. It's about understanding what you're trading away either way. Mark gave up liquidity and mobility in exchange for stability, leverage, and long-term control over where he lives. Dan gave up housing certainty in exchange for flexibility, liquidity, and a bigger pile of money sitting in the market. Neither choice was automatically brilliant. Neither was automatically a mistake. It really comes down to two questions. How long are you actually planning to stay put? Because buy a house and bail 3 years later, and transaction costs alone can wreck you. And if you rent, will you genuinely invest what you save? Because rent for 20 years and spend every extra dollar, and that entire advantage disappears into thin air. So no, renting isn't automatically throwing money away. Renters pay rent, homeowners pay interest, taxes, insurance, upkeep, and closing cost. Both are paying for a place to live, and yes, owning a home absolutely can build serious wealth. But it's also an expensive, hard-to-sell asset that comes with concentration risk and a roof that occasionally demands $12,000 out of nowhere. The winner here isn't always the buyer, and it isn't always the renter. Mark needed enough years for ownership to pay off. Dan needed the discipline to actually invest month after month without fail, because 20 years down the line, the real gap between them wasn't about who bought a house and who signed a lease. It was about what each of them actually did after making that call. If this broke down the numbers in a way that finally made sense, subscribe for more videos like this one. And tell me in the comments, are you buying, renting, or holding out for rates and prices to drop at the same time? If it's the third one, good luck with that.